She was too poor, too plain, too heavy to stand beside a man like him. When Mara Whitlock walked onto that wedding stage, an entire town laughed out loud, and nobody bothered to hide it. They thought Colton Reeves had lost his mind. They thought she would break under the weight of their contempt. They were wrong about all of it. What this town did to her on the happiest day of her life, and what she did to this town when the fires came, that is a story nobody who lived through it ever forgot. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. Like, follow and stay until the very last word. The dress had taken Mara Whitlock 3 weeks to make. She had cut the fabric herself from 2 separate bolts she bought at a discount from a dry goods store in Caldwell. Ivory cotton, not silk, with a narrow strip of lace along the collar that she had unpicked from her mother's old Sunday blouse. She had stayed up past midnight more nights than she could count, working by lamplight at the kitchen table, stitching and restitching the seams so they would lie flat and clean against her wide hips. She had pricked her fingers so many times that the tips had gone permanently tender by the time she set the last stitch. It was not a beautiful dress by any standard the women of Harlan Ridge would have recognized. The lace was old and slightly yellowed. The hem on the left side dipped a 1/4 inch lower than the right, because Mara had no dressmaker's form and had fitted it against herself using a cracked mirror propped against the bedroom wall. The waist seam pulled tight across her stomach in a way that no amount of letting out had fully fixed. But it was hers. She had made it with her own hands, and on the morning of her wedding day, standing in the single room she still called home, the small, sagging house her father had built and then abandoned to debt, she looked at herself in that cracked mirror and thought, "This is enough. I am enough." She had been telling herself that for a long time. It had not always been easy to believe. Harlan Ridge sat at the edge of dry country, where the grass went brown by July, and the creek ran thin by August, and every family that survived there did so because someone in their bloodline had figured out how to outlast a bad year. It was not a glamorous town. It had one main street, a hardware store, a post office, 2 saloons, a church nobody attended in summer because the heat inside was unbearable, and a social hierarchy as rigid and unforgiving as a fence post sunk in frozen ground. At the top of that hierarchy sat the ranching families, the Deacons, the Pratts, the Hallorans, men who had come early and grabbed land when it was cheap and held it through drought and cattle sickness, and every other calamity the frontier threw at them. They had money, or the appearance of money, which in a town like Harlan Ridge amounted to the same thing. And then there was Colton Reeves. Colton did not fit neatly into any category Harlan Ridge had ready-made. He had arrived 11 years ago with a modest sum of inheritance money, bought a neglected piece of land nobody else wanted, rocky soil, no reliable water source, a half-collapsed barn, and spent the next decade turning it into something real. Reeves Ranch was not the largest operation in the territory. It was not the flashiest, but it was the most consistent, and in dry country, consistency was worth more than flash. Colton ran lean, paid his workers fairly, never oversold what he had, and never bought what he couldn't afford. He was not beloved exactly. The older ranching families found him too quiet, too careful, too unwilling to participate in the social performance that lubricated Harlan Ridge's sense of itself. But he was respected. Even the men who didn't like him admitted he knew what he was doing. He was also, by the age of 34, unmarried. This was a fact that occupied the minds of a substantial number of Harlan Ridge's female population and an even larger number of their mothers. The reasons Colton had given for his continued bachelorhood over the years were vague. He was busy, the timing wasn't right, he hadn't found the right woman, and vague answers in a small town breed very specific speculation. There had been a period, several years back, when Nora Deacon had seemed like a likely match, and the Whisper Network had been practically humming with anticipation until nothing came of it. There had been a brief moment with a school teacher from Cale who visited one summer and then went back to Cale without explanation. So when the news came in early October that Colton Reeves was to be married, a real announcement, a date set, invitations distributed, the town erupted with the particular energy of long-delayed certainty. And then people found out who the bride was. Mara Whitlock was 29 years old. She had lived her whole life in and around Harlan Ridge, which meant that nearly everyone in town had formed their opinion of her long before she had the chance to form one of herself. Her father, Dale Whitlock, had been a man of enthusiasms. Enthusiastic about schemes that never panned out, enthusiastic about credit he couldn't repay, enthusiastic about leaving when things got hard. He had abandoned the family when Mara was 12, following some rumor of silver to the north, and had sent exactly 2 letters in the years since, neither of which contained money or a return address. Her mother, Clara, had kept the household alive through a combination of taking in laundry, selling eggs, and the kind of grinding stubbornness that passes for resilience when there is no other option available. Clara had died 4 years ago. Heart, the doctor said, though Mara privately believed it was exhaustion, and left Mara the house, a small amount of debt, and the habit of doing things for herself because there was no one else to do them. Mara worked at the Harlan Ridge Mercantile 3 days a week, keeping the accounts. She helped tend the Halloran widow's kitchen garden in exchange for vegetables. She fixed fences, chopped wood, patched the house's leaking roof with the same patient stubbornness her mother had passed down like a family heirloom. She was not glamorous. She was not the kind of woman men wrote poems about or escorted to dances. She was heavy-set and plain-faced, with strong hands and thick, practical braids she wore pinned at the back of her neck, and brown eyes that were her best feature if you took the time to look, which most people in Harlan Ridge had decided they did not need to. The town's verdict on Mara Whitlock had been delivered years ago and never revisited. She was the kind of woman you felt sorry for, not the kind of woman you envied. She was surviving, not thriving. She was making do, not making something. How she and Colton Reeves had found their way to each other was a question that occupied the town's gossip circuit for weeks before the wedding and never received a fully satisfying answer. The version that eventually hardened into accepted fact, because gossip always needs a villain, was that Mara had positioned herself strategically, had targeted Colton with a plan, had been clever and manipulative in ways that a man as private as Colton would be particularly vulnerable to. This version was wrong, but it was useful to the people who believed it, and so it stuck. The truth was quieter. Colton had begun hiring Mara on a seasonal basis 2 years earlier to help manage the supply accounting. His foreman had recommended her as someone who was good with numbers and reliable. She was both. They had worked together at the ranch house kitchen table through 2 full seasons, going over inventory lists and supplier invoices and the grinding mathematics of running an operation that never had quite enough slack in the budget. They had talked, not romantically, not at first. They had talked about work and then gradually about other things, the way people do when they spend enough time in the same room. Colton had found, to his mild surprise, that he looked forward to Tuesday afternoons when Mara came to go over the books. She was direct. She didn't perform. She had opinions she stated plainly and changed without embarrassment when presented with better information. She laughed at things that were actually funny and not at things that weren't. He had asked her to marry him in the spring, in the ranch house kitchen, with the window open and the smell of new grass coming through the screen. He had not been elegant about it. He had said, "I think we work well together and I'd like to keep it permanent if you're willing." It was not a romantic proposal by any measure. Mara had sat with it for a long moment and then said, "You should know I won't change how I look or how I am." He had said, "I know that. It's why I'm asking." She had said yes. Sean. The ceremony was held in the open lot beside the Harlan Ridge Meeting Hall, as was the custom for summer and early fall weddings when the building itself couldn't hold the crowd. A wooden platform had been set up at the north end, with chairs arranged in rough rows on the trampled grass. The weather had cooperated. It was cool for October, with a high pale sky and a dry wind out of the west that smelled faintly of dust and distant rain. Most of the town came. They came for various reasons. Some came because they knew Colton and wanted to pay their respects. Some came because they were genuinely curious. Even those who had formed their opinions of Mara Whitlock were not immune to the novelty of seeing how this was going to go. And some, a smaller number, though not small enough, came with the particular anticipatory energy of people who expect to witness something embarrassing and have decided in advance that they are entitled to be entertained. Mara arrived on foot. She didn't have a carriage, and she hadn't asked anyone to provide one. She walked the 3/4 of a mile from her house to the meeting lot in her ivory dress and her good boots, carrying a small bunch of dried wildflowers that she had put together herself, And she kept her chin up the entire way because her mother had told her once that the only thing you can control when people are watching you is how you carry yourself. She heard the laughter before she reached the platform. It started near the back of the chairs and moved forward like a wave, the way things do in crowds when people take their permission from each other. She saw it happen, saw the moment when a group of women near the middle recognized her and leaned together, and then the men beside them turned to look, and then the sound started. Not everyone laughed. A fair number of people sat still with uncomfortable expressions, the particular discomfort of people who don't participate but don't stop it either. But enough laughed, enough to fill the air with it, enough to make it impossible to pretend it wasn't happening. Is that her? Lord above, he could have had anyone in this county, and he picked, "Get her off the stage, she doesn't belong up there." That last one was said loudly, by a woman named Deirdre Pratt, Rupert Pratt's wife, who had decided years ago that Mara Whitlock was beneath her notice and saw no reason to revise that view for a wedding ceremony. She said it without shame, the way people say things when they are confident that the room agrees with them. Mara stopped walking for exactly 1 second. 1 second in which she felt the laughter land on her like something physical, in which she felt the cold, familiar feeling of being looked at and found wanting, of being the thing people turn toward when they want to feel better about themselves by comparison. She had felt this feeling before. She had felt it at school and at church and at every social gathering she had ever forced herself to attend because her mother had said, "You cannot hide forever, Mara, and hiding doesn't make it stop." Her mother had been right, and it had never gotten easier. She made herself take the next step, then the next one. She walked to the base of the platform. Colton was standing at the top of it. He was wearing his good jacket, dark wool slightly stiff because he almost never wore it, and his hat, which he had brushed clean. He was not a man who drew attention with his appearance. He was not particularly tall, not particularly handsome, with a weathered face that showed every year of outdoor work and dark eyes that tended to watch things carefully before he spoke. He was looking at Mara. He stepped down from the platform. He walked to her. He took her hand, her broad, work-roughened hand, and held it in both of his, and then he turned to face the crowd. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a speech. He said, "Anyone who wants to leave is welcome to." He said it flatly, without anger, without performance. The way a man states a fact he considers self-evident. Nobody left. The laughter died. Not all at once. It guttered out in pieces, in small groups, the way things die when the permission for them is withdrawn. Deirdre Pratt pressed her lips together and said nothing further. Her husband put his hand on her arm. The uncomfortable people in the middle rows became slightly less uncomfortable. Colton turned back to Mara. He said very quietly, just for her, "You all right?" She looked up at him. Her eyes were stinging, and she was not going to cry. Absolutely not. Not here. Not in front of these people who had laughed at her. She said, "I will be." He nodded once, like she'd given him exactly the answer he expected. "Then let's get married." They walked up to the platform together, her hand in his. Quote, the reverend who performed the ceremony was a lean, sunburned man named Aldous Kerr, who had been conducting Harlan Ridge's weddings and funerals for 15 years and had long since run out of the capacity to be surprised by what people did at them. He moved through the ceremony at his usual measured pace, and Mara held herself together line by line, word by word, the way you get through something you cannot afford to fall apart in. She was aware of the crowd the entire time. She was aware of the watching and the whispering that had replaced the laughter but had not disappeared. She was aware of the particular silence of people who have been publicly checked and are now calculating whether to hold their ground or stand down. She kept her eyes on the Reverend, and then on Colton's face when she was supposed to look at him, and she said her words clearly enough to be heard. When Colton said his vows, he said them like a man who had thought about them beforehand and meant the words precisely as they were stated. Not dramatically, not as a performance for the crowd. He looked at Mara and said what he said, and it landed on her like something solid, something she could actually hold on to. When it was over, when the Reverend said the thing Reverends say at the end, Colton kissed her once, briefly, on the forehead. It was not the grand romantic gesture the crowd might have expected. It was a quiet, deliberate thing. the kind of gesture that means I see you and I am here. Mara exhaled for the first time in what felt like 20 minutes. The reception was held in the meeting hall itself. Long tables had been set up with food that had been contributed by various members of the community. This was the custom in Harlan Ridge, where no individual family threw a party alone if the community could be leveraged. And there was a fiddle player and enough floor space for dancing if anyone was inclined. Mara was not inclined. She sat at the main table and ate and spoke when people came to speak to her, and she watched the room sort itself out the way rooms do at events like this. The people who had laughed were not, by and large, the people who came to speak to her. The people who came to her were the ones she already knew. The mercantile owner's wife, who pressed her hand warmly. Tom Adler, who ran one of the smaller ranches east of town and had brought his whole family. A few of the ranch hands from Reeves Ranch, who had cleaned up for the occasion and stood awkwardly near the food table looking genuinely pleased. Nora Deacon came to her. Nora was everything Mara was not. Tall, fine-featured, dressed in deep green silk that had come from a catalog and cost more than Mara made in 2 months. She had the particular carriage of a woman who had been told she was beautiful so consistently and for so long that she had stopped thinking about it and simply walked through the world as though it were arranged for her. She sat down across from Mara without being invited and looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Not cruel, not warm, somewhere in between. "Well," Nora said. Mara waited. "I'm not going to say congratulations the way everyone says congratulations when they don't mean it." Nora folded her hands on the table. "I'll say this instead. I don't know what you have that convinced him. I've known Colton Reeves for 7 years and I couldn't convince him to take me to a single dance." She paused. "So whatever it is, I suppose it's real." It was possibly the strangest thing anyone had ever said to Mara. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an insult or some amalgamation of the two that didn't have a name. "Thank you," she said, because it seemed like the least dangerous response. Nora stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked away. She did not speak to Mara again that evening. Colton found her when the fiddle started. He sat down beside her and they watched people dance for a while. Some of the younger ranch hands, a few of the farming families from the eastern quarter, a couple of children who were supposed to be sitting with their parents but had escaped. "You did well," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You mean I didn't fall apart?" "I mean you did well." He was looking straight ahead. "That was harder than it should have been." "Yes. I should have done something sooner about the invitation list." She shook her head. "You can't uninvite half the town from a public wedding. It doesn't work that way." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have done something, though." "What you did was enough." She said it and meant it. She thought about him stepping down from that platform, coming to her. She thought about the way his hand had felt around hers. Not careful, not tentative, just there. Solid. Decided. It was enough, Colton. He turned to look at her then. He had a way of looking at her. Direct, unhurried, like he was actually considering what she'd said instead of waiting for his turn to talk. "I made you a promise," he said, in front of all of them. She remembered. No one would shame her again. He had said it quietly, to her, not to the crowd, but the crowd had heard it. "I know. I intend to keep it." She looked at him for a long moment. There was a part of her, the part that had been formed by years of being the wrong kind of woman in the wrong kind of place, that wanted to say, don't make promises you can't keep, or you can't stop people from thinking what they think. There was a part of her that had been braced for disappointment for so long that it had forgotten how to unbrace. She didn't say any of that. Instead, she said, "Then I guess we'd better get to work." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something near it. "Guess so," he said. They drove back to the ranch in Colton's wagon as the evening light went the color of old copper across the dry grass. Mara sat with her hands folded in her lap and the wildflower bunch she'd carried across the lot, still clutched in one fist, slightly crushed now, but still intact. The road ran through open country for 2 miles before it turned toward the ranch gate, and there was nobody on it in the evening light, and the sound of the wheels and the horses was all there was. She thought about the laughter. She thought about the woman who had said, "Get her off the stage." She thought about those words and where they had come from. Not just cruelty, though there was cruelty in them, but a whole structure of belief that said certain people belonged in certain places and not others, that worth was visible and legible from the outside, that the distance between a woman like her and a life like this was fundamental and not just circumstantial. She thought about Colton's hand around hers. She thought about, "Let's get married," said like it was simply the next logical step. The wagon rolled on through the copper light. Ahead, the outline of the ranch house appeared against the pale sky. The big barn, the water tower, the fence lines running out in both directions across the land Colton had worked for a decade to turn into something real. This was her home now. She had not changed her appearance, as several women at the reception had clearly expected her to. No elaborate hairstyle, no borrowed finery, no attempt to be something she was not. She had shown up in the dress she made herself, with her rough hands and her plain face and the full weight of who she was, and she had walked through the laughter and come out the other side. It was not a triumphant feeling. It was not a storybook feeling. It was something more complicated and more honest than either of those. Something that felt like the particular exhaustion of a hard thing done, and underneath the exhaustion, quietly, the first small ember of something that might eventually become pride. She was Mrs. Colton Reeves. The town had laughed. The town had told her she didn't belong. The town was going to have to get used to being wrong. Dick. The first week of married life at Reeves Ranch was nothing like she had imagined it might be, mostly because she had spent so little time imagining it. She had been too busy being realistic. Romance was a luxury she had stopped affording herself years ago. What she found instead was something more durable than romance: work, shared work. The particular rhythm of a household where both people were practical and neither was interested in pretending otherwise. The ranch ran on a tight schedule. Colton was up before dawn. His foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Abe Cutler, who had worked the place for 6 years, ran the outdoor operations with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste time on anything that doesn't need to be done. The household itself had been managed for the past 2 years by a woman named Griselda, who came in 3 days a week and kept the cooking and cleaning at a functional level and departed without ceremony. Mara took stock of everything methodically: the kitchen stores, the feed costs, and how they mapped against the herd numbers, the account books, which she already knew but looked at again with fresh eyes, now that the ranch was not just a client, but hers. She found 3 separate places where money was leaking out through small inefficiencies: feed being ordered on a schedule that didn't track with actual consumption, a supplier being paid above market rate out of habit, household supplies being purchased in quantities that went to waste before they were used. She did not make a production of finding these things. She made notes. She brought them to Colton one evening after supper and went through them simply, the same way she'd have done a Tuesday afternoon accounting session. Colton looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a while. "How long has the feed been off?" he asked. "At least 2 seasons, from the records." She showed him the column. "It's not a disaster, just waste." He nodded slowly. "All right." He looked up at her. "I should have caught that." "You were busy running a ranch," she said. "Now there are 2 of us looking." He looked at her for a moment with that careful, deliberate expression of his. "Yes," he said, "there are." The town, meanwhile, had not finished with them. Mara discovered this on her first solo trip into Harlan Ridge 10 days after the wedding. She needed supplies. Nothing extraordinary, a list of basic goods from the mercantile and some thread from the dry goods store. She hitched the light wagon herself and drove the 3 miles into town on a Tuesday morning with her list in her pocket and the same practical intentionality she brought to every other task. The dry goods store was her first stop. Lena Marsh ran it with her husband, a quiet, broad-shouldered woman who had always been civil enough to Mara in previous years. She was behind the counter when Mara came in, and she looked up, and something shifted in her face, a closing, subtle, but unmistakable. The kind of shift that happens when someone has made a decision about you and is now executing it. "Mrs. Whitlock," Lena said. "Reeves," Mara said without heat. "It's Reeves now." A brief pause. "What do you need?" Mara put her list on the counter. Lena looked at it and then began moving through the store, pulling items with an efficiency that managed to communicate somehow that she would rather be doing this for someone else. She set the items on the counter without comment. When Mara paid, Lena took the money and counted the change with a precision that felt like a statement. "I've been getting my thread from you for 4 years," Mara said, as Lena was wrapping the spools. "I know that. I'd like to keep doing that." Lena looked up. Her face was not unkind, exactly. It was careful. The face of a woman who was aware she was doing something she might not be entirely comfortable with, but who had decided to do it anyway. "Things change," she said. "Things change." It was vague enough to mean nothing and specific enough to mean everything. Mara took her package and her change and left the store. The mercantile was worse. The owner himself, a man named George Partlin, who had known Mara's mother and shaken her father's hand at various points over the years, and who had employed Mara on his account books for 2 years, emerged from the back room when she came in and told her, with elaborate regret and without looking at her directly, that he was going to have to let her go from the accounts work. "Budget," he said. "Reorganizing," he said. "Nothing personal," he said, in exactly the tone of voice that means it is very personal indeed. Mara looked at him for a long moment. "George," she said, "you've known me since I was 8 years old." He looked briefly pained. "Mara, Mrs. Reeves." She said it quietly, not aggressively, just correctly. He closed his mouth. He looked at the counter. "I'm sorry," he said, and she thought he might actually mean part of it. There are people who have business with me who've told you it's them or me." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She bought what she needed, paid in full, and drove back to the ranch with her jaw set and her hands steady on the reins and a full inventory of what had just happened running through her mind. It was not a surprise. It was not, if she was honest, more than she had expected. But it was real. And it was ongoing. And it was going to be a fact of her life in a way that would require a response. The question was what kind. She did not tell Colton immediately, not because she was hiding it from him, but because she wanted to think it through first, wanted to understand what she was looking at before she brought it to him, the same way she looked at a column of numbers before she spoke about what they meant. What she was looking at was this. The town's social machinery had decided to register its displeasure with Colton's marriage by making life difficult for Mara. Not illegal, not violent, just the steady, grinding, entirely civilized cruelty of withdrawal, of doors not opened, counters turned cool, invitations not issued, backs turned at the right moments. It was the kind of thing that worked on people who needed the town's approval to survive. Mara had stopped needing that approval a long time ago. She had built a life that required very little of Harlan Ridge's goodwill because she had never had enough of it to count on. But Colton had business interests that ran through the town. He had suppliers, creditors, a web of relationships that kept the ranch functional. And if the town's displeasure extended to those relationships, if it reached the people Colton depended on, then this was not just about her. She told him that evening. All of it, straightforwardly, without dramatizing it or minimizing it. She watched his face as she talked. He was still, the particular stillness of someone who is paying close attention and keeping his reactions controlled. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Partlin." "Yes." "I'll speak to him." "Don't." She said it before she'd fully decided to. He looked at her. She continued, "If you fight every battle for me, it'll make things worse. It'll look like I can't handle myself. You shouldn't have to handle it alone." "I'm not alone. You're right here." She looked at him. "But you fighting George Partlin over my feelings won't change the way the town looks at me. The only thing that changes that is time and evidence." He thought about it. She watched him think about it, the careful, unhurried process he brought to everything. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He nodded slowly, and she could see that he didn't fully like it, but he accepted it. "What do you want to do?" She had been thinking about that on the drive back from town. What she wanted to do was what she always did. Work the problem, not the feelings. She had been watching the ranch for 2 seasons now. She had seen where the edges were, the places where things worked because someone had made them work, and the places where nobody had gotten around to fixing what was broken. She had seen the ranch hands and the seasonal workers and the small network of farming families and minor operations that surrounded Reeves Ranch like a ring of satellites. "I want to be useful," she said. "More useful than they're expecting." Colton looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" "Don't tell me no without a reason," she said. "And let me try things even when you're not sure they'll work." He thought about it. "Fair enough," he said. She thought that was about as good as promises got. October went, and November came in dry. The grass had been short since September, and the cattle were feeling it. Mara could tell from the way the herd moved when she rode out to check the far pastures, the particular restlessness of animals that weren't getting quite enough. She began doing something she'd noticed nobody at the ranch was currently doing, keeping a systematic daily record of which pastures were being used, in what rotation, and what the grass cover looked like in each. It was simple. It was tedious. Nobody had asked her to do it. After 2 weeks of records, she brought the data to Abe Cutler and laid it out for him without preamble. Abe was a man of about 50 with a face like old leather and the kind of natural skepticism that came from having been disappointed by new ideas before. He looked at her notes with the careful neutrality of a man deciding whether something was worth his time. "You're rotating too fast through the east pastures," she said. "They need another 10 days before the herd goes back." He looked at the numbers. He didn't respond immediately. "I'm not trying to tell you your job," she said. "I just have the records in front of me. I can see what you have." He looked up. "You figure this from numbers alone?" "From numbers and from riding out there yesterday morning." She showed him the note she'd made. "The cover's down to about 30% in the east section. If the herd goes back in before it recovers, you'll lose that pasture for the season." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I'll push them west for another stretch." That was all. No thank you. No acknowledgement that she'd brought him something useful. He just folded the paper, tucked it in his pocket, and went back to his work. But 2 weeks later, when she was checking the east pastures on her own morning ride, she found the herd had not returned to them. The grass was recovering. He had done what she'd said. She did not make anything of it. But she noted it. There was a woman named Bess Lowell who lived in a sod house on the eastern edge of the ranch's property, on a strip of land that bordered Reeves territory, but technically belonged to a farming claim her husband had filed 6 years before. Bess's husband had died of a fever 2 summers back, leaving her with 3 children under 9, a few cattle, a kitchen garden, and a claim that the Harlan Ridge banking operation had been making inquiries about ever since. Mara found Bess on one of her rides, found her in the practical sense of noticing a woman attempting to repair a section of fence on her own with a 9-year-old boy holding the post while she tried to stretch wire, and stopped to help without being asked. They fixed the fence together. Bess fed her coffee on the sod house step afterward, and they talked for an hour. Bess was sharp and tired in the way that women who have been managing alone too long get sharp and tired. Not defeated, but worn thin. She had been managing the claim on her own for 2 years. The bank had sent 2 letters suggesting she might want to consider selling before the claim became too much to maintain. She had ignored them. "How much do you owe them?" Mara asked. Bess told her. Mara did the arithmetic in her head. It was not a crippling number. It was the kind of number that seemed large when you were alone and small when you had help. "What's your groundwater like?" "There's a spring on the north end." Bess looked at her carefully. "Why?" "Because your claim has things on it that are worth more than the bank is telling you they're worth," Mara said. "Water and grazing buffer this close to town. That's not a struggling homestead, Bess. That's leverage, if you know how to use it." Bess studied her for a long moment. "You're the new Reeves woman." "I am. They say you married him for the money." "I know what they say." Mara set down her coffee cup. "I married him because he respects my opinion and doesn't talk over me when I'm explaining things. But that's not what we were discussing." Bess looked at her and then looked away and then looked back. And very slowly she began to smile. A real smile. The kind that came from somewhere genuine. "All right," she said. "Tell me about the leverage." "Look, there were others. There always were, on the margins of a place like Harlan Ridge. People the town's main social machinery didn't bother with because they weren't useful to it. A family named Ruiz, who ran a small goat operation south of the creek, and had been cheated on a water rights transaction 2 years back in a way nobody had bothered to formally address. An old man named Harker, who kept a weather station of his own design and had been logging temperature and rainfall data for 8 years and had no idea what it was worth. 2 young men, brothers named Cal and Pete Story, who were good workers and good horsemen and couldn't get hired on any of the main ranches because they'd come from a failed claim and the failure was being held against them. Mara moved through all of it the same way she moved through an account book, steadily, without performance, noting what was there. She didn't have a plan in any grand sense. She was not engineering a campaign. She was doing what she had always done, finding problems and solving them, because problems left unsolved got worse, and getting worse meant someone who couldn't afford it got hurt. The town watched, and it whispered, and it continued to find her presence at Colton Reeves's side an offense against its sense of natural order. Deirdre Pratt, at a gathering Mara was not invited to, described her as below herself in a tone that left no ambiguity about what that meant. The Halloran brothers, who had their own history of friction with Colton over water access, began circulating a story that Mara had married him under false pretenses, that she'd hidden debts, that she'd presented herself as more financially stable than she was. It was a lie with teeth. Mara heard it from Bess, who had heard it from a woman at the feed store, who had heard it from someone who had been at one of the Hallorans' dinner parties. She heard it and felt the familiar cold weight of it settle over her, the particular weight of a story told about you that you cannot fully disprove because it lives in people's minds and not in the world where evidence lives. She could have gone to Colton with it. He would have been angry. He would have confronted the Hallorans, possibly, or at minimum made clear in the tight social economy of Harlan Ridge that he was aware of what was being said and would not tolerate it. She thought about it. She turned it over. And then she folded the story away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that were real problems rather than just painful ones, and she went back to work. She was building something. She didn't have a name for it yet, but it was building. The first real test came in late November. There had been no rain for 6 weeks. The creek was down to a trickle and the wells were dropping. Families south of town were hauling water from the Reeves wells. Colton had opened them up for community use, which was not universally appreciated by the ranching families who saw it as disrupting whatever informal water hierarchy had previously existed. The Deacons and the Pratt Ranch had their own deep wells and didn't need Reeves water, and they made it quietly known that they found the gesture more political than generous. But the farming families needed it, and they came. Mara organized the hauling schedule. It was not glamorous work. It was logistics. The particular grind of coordinating who came when so the queue didn't back up, making sure the families with the furthest distance got early slots so they weren't traveling home in the dark. She built a ledger for it, kept track of who had come and when, noticed which families were getting enough and which were stretching it too thin. She found a family, the Garcias, who had a claim 3 miles east, who had not come to the wells at all. She rode out to check. She found their eldest boy, maybe 14, trying to haul water by hand from a seep in a dry creek bed that was more mud than water. She found his parents in a state of exhaustion and careful pride, the particular pride of people who ask for nothing because they've been made to feel they have no right to ask. She drove back with the boy to the Reeves wells and made sure he got 2 full barrels. She rode back to the Garcia claim with him to make sure the barrels made it safely. She did not make an occasion of it. She did not tell anyone she'd done it. Mrs. Garcia thanked her at the door of their sod house, and Mara saw in the woman's face the same complicated mix of gratitude and something that was not quite shame but was adjacent to it. The particular feeling of having been helped by someone when you'd expected to be overlooked. "You don't have to thank me," Mara said. "You'd do the same." She drove back to the ranch in the November cold with the empty wagon and the particular kind of tiredness that comes from a day that mattered, the kind that settles into your bones, not as weight, but as ballast. The town was still laughing at her. The Pratt woman had not stopped whispering. George Partlin had not offered her back the accounts work. She was still the wrong kind of woman in the wrong kind of place, by the town's accounting. But the Garcia boy had water. Bess Lowell's fence was mended. Abe Cutler's east pastures were recovering. She had not changed her appearance. She had not tried to become someone the town approved of. She had simply, quietly, persistently refused to be what they expected. The winter was coming. The frontier had its own calculations, and they ran independent of who was invited to whose dinner party, independent of who whispered what in whose ear at the feed store. Out here, competence was not a social virtue. It was a survival fact. And Mara Whitlock, Mara Reeves, had been competent her whole life. The town just hadn't been paying attention. The winter arrived without ceremony and without mercy. By December, the creek had stopped running entirely, reduced to a series of disconnected pools that froze overnight and thawed to mud by midday. The sky stayed low and gray for weeks at a stretch, and the wind off the plain had an edge to it that cut through wool like it was cotton. The ranching families who had deep wells and full hay stores settled in for the season with the particular comfort of people who have prepared and know it. The families without those advantages made different calculations. Mara kept her ledger of the water hauling through December and into January. The names in it told their own story. Which families came back every 3 days, which came every 5, which stretched it to 7, and came back thinner around the face and quieter than they'd been before. She tracked it without comment, without making anyone feel observed. When she noticed the Story brothers, Cal and Pete, who'd been helping with odd jobs around the ranch since October, loading extra barrels at the end of a haul run, she didn't ask them where the extra was going. She already knew. There was a cluster of 3 families on the eastern edge of the territory who weren't on her ledger because they hadn't come to ask. She'd found that out from Cal, in pieces, over the course of several conversations that had started as practical and turned personal, the way conversations sometimes do when people are cold and tired and the social distance between them collapses. "The Minners won't come," Cal had said one afternoon, stacking hay bales in the east barn while Mara made notes on the supply count. "Old man Minter figures it's charity, and he doesn't take charity." "Is it charity?" Mara asked, not looking up from her ledger. Cal thought about it. "I guess it depends on whether you expect something back." "I don't expect anything back." "Then maybe don't call it charity," he said. "Maybe just call it a neighbor with a working well." She looked up at him then. Cal Story was 22, with a young face that was getting harder around the edges from outdoor work and a kind of careful watchfulness that came from having been in precarious situations long enough to read them as a matter of habit. He met her eyes without the particular evasiveness she'd come to expect from people who weren't sure yet what to do with her. "You're right," she said. "Tell Minter the well needs 2 people to operate the pump correctly. Tell him we need the help." Cal looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth shifted. "That's a good lie." "It's not entirely a lie," she said. "The pump is stiff in cold weather. An extra pair of hands is genuinely useful." The Minter family came to the well the following week. Mara put the old man to work on the pump handle without making any comment about charity, and he worked it with a rigid dignity that she respected, even while she found it somewhat exhausting. By the end of the second visit, something had loosened in him, barely perceptibly. The way things do when the fear of obligation turns out to be worse than the obligation itself. She added them to the ledger. Colton watched all of this from the particular distance of a man who trusted what he was seeing but was still learning what it meant. He was not a man who inserted himself into things that were running well. He had built his operation on the principle that if you hired people who knew what they were doing and stayed out of their way, things went better than if you micromanaged them into resentment. He applied this to Mara the same way he applied it to Abe Cutler, which she found both respectful and occasionally maddening, because there were moments when she would have liked some form of visible recognition that what she was doing was working. She got it, eventually, in his way. One evening, in January, he came in from checking the north fence line and found her at the kitchen table with the ledger and a separate set of notes she'd been compiling on the families in her water network. Who had what skills, what their land situations were, where there were opportunities for the kind of informal labor exchange that could make a lean year more survivable for everyone. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his coat, and looked at what she was doing for a long moment. "You're building something," he said. "I'm trying to." He came to the table and looked at the notes without touching them, the way he looked at things before he had an opinion. "This family," he said, pointing to the Ruiz name. "I know they got taken on the water rights claim. Halloran's man was involved in that transaction." "I know." Mara had been sitting on that information for 2 months, waiting until she had more context. "Do you know the details?" "Enough of them." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. This was unusual. Colton tended to stand for conversations, moving through them with the same efficiency he brought to physical work. When he sat, it meant he was settling in. The claim was filed through a county office in Cale. The documentation on the water access was written ambiguously. Halloran's man, a fellow named Sutton, he handles a lot of their paperwork, filed a counterclaim 6 months after the original and got a favorable ruling from a judge who owed Halloran a favor. Mara was quiet for a moment. That's not legal. A lot of things that happen through county offices aren't legal, Colton said, without particular heat. That's why people with money and connections keep winning them. If the original documentation is still on file at the county, the ambiguity might be arguable. She was thinking aloud, not making promises. If someone knew how to read land claims. Do you know how to read land claims? Not yet, she said, but I know someone who might. She was thinking of old Harker, the weather station man, who had mentioned in passing that he'd worked as a county surveyor for 15 years before retiring to his Hilltop Instruments. She had filed that away the way she filed away most things, without knowing immediately what it was for. Colton looked at her across the table. You've been paying attention to a lot of things people don't usually pay attention to. I've had a lot of time to pay attention, she said. My social calendar hasn't been very full. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. No, he said. I suppose it hasn't. It was the first moment, she thought afterward, where the particular weight of what the town was doing to her had been acknowledged between them with something other than seriousness. The lightness of it was small, but it was real. She held on to it. The social exclusion had settled, by January, into a pattern she had mapped thoroughly enough to stop being surprised by. Merchants served her with cold efficiency. The women's social organizing that constituted Harlan Ridge's community calendar, the gatherings, the sewing circles, the informal networks through which information and assistance moved, proceeded as though she did not exist. She received no invitations. When she appeared in public spaces where the town's women gathered, conversations rerouted around her like water around an obstacle. The one exception was Nora Deacon, who had taken to greeting her with a careful nod whenever they encountered each other in town, which was more than most people offered. Mara didn't trust it exactly, but she noted it as a data point. The rumors about her had multiplied and cross-pollinated in ways she had mostly stopped trying to track. The one about the hidden debts had been succeeded by a newer one suggesting she had come from a disreputable family. Truer than she would have liked, if you counted her father, though not in the way the rumor implied. There was a version circulating through the Pratt social circle that she had forged her way into the ranch accounts job in the first place, which was simply false but had the advantage of being unprovable in either direction. None of it touched Colton's standing in any material way, which was itself a statement about how Harlan Ridge's social mathematics worked. His reputation was structural, built into the town's economy in a way that individual gossip couldn't easily dislodge. His business relationships stayed intact. His credit held. What the town's displeasure cost him was social, not financial, and he had never much valued the social currency to begin with. What it cost Mara was different. It cost her in the small daily ways that don't look like much in isolation. The woman at the postal counter who processed her mail without making eye contact. The table that cleared one chair too many when she entered the meeting hall during a public information session about the water shortage. The children who had been taught, explicitly or by example, to ignore her. None of it was illegal. None of it was the kind of thing you could point to and say, here, this is the damage. It was the texture of every day, and the effort of moving through it without letting it hollow you out was its own kind of work. She talked to Bess Lowell about it one afternoon in February when she stopped to check on the claim. Bess had made coffee, and they sat at her kitchen table while the three children moved around the small space with the particular energy of children who have been inside too long. The youngest, a girl of about 4, had decided Mara was interesting and had climbed onto the bench beside her without asking and was now leaning against her arm with the absolute confidence of a child who has not yet learned to assess whether she is welcome. Does it get easier? Mara asked, because she was tired enough that day to ask directly. Bess thought about it. She was not a woman who softened things unnecessarily. No, she said, but you get harder. That's not the same thing. No, Bess agreed. It's not. But harder is what you get. She looked at her coffee. My mother used to say that people who've been treated like they don't matter have two choices. You can believe them or you can outlast them. She looked up. She had a lot of opinions about which one was worth doing. Which did she think? She thought outlasting was harder and better, and she said it every time she was tired enough to stop doing it herself. Bess said it without bitterness, just with the flatness of someone reporting a true thing. I think about that. On the bad days. Mara looked at the 4-year-old pressed against her side who had fallen half asleep and was making a small sound of absolute contentment. She thought about what it meant to outlast something, not to defeat it in some dramatic public way, the kind of defeat that looked good in the telling, just to still be there, to still be upright and functional and present when the thing you were outlasting had moved on to easier targets. I'm working on it, she said. I know you are, Bess said. We can all see that. We. Mara turned the word over. It was not a word she had applied to herself in relation to other people in Harlan Ridge for a long time. She had been I for so long, a single unit moving through hostile country, that the suggestion of we felt both welcome and slightly disorienting, the way warmth does when you've been cold for a very long time. The business with the Ruiz water rights had moved slowly through February. Old Harker had agreed, after 3 visits and several hours of conversation about weather station methodology that Mara had found genuinely interesting and had not had to pretend to look at the original county documentation. He had come back from Kale 2 weeks later with a copy of the claim file and a handwritten summary of what he'd found, written in the meticulous script of a man who had spent decades writing precise measurements and had no tolerance for imprecision. The water rights counterclaim was not airtight. Harker had found 2 irregularities in the original filing, a notarization that didn't match the date on the primary document and a boundary description that referenced a survey marker that had not been officially placed at the time of filing. Neither irregularity was individually decisive. Together, they were enough to open a formal challenge. This doesn't guarantee anything, Harker said, sitting across the kitchen table from Mara and the Ruiz family, Jose and Carmen, both of them quiet with a careful hope that they were clearly trying not to let show too visibly. A challenge through the county office could take months, and Halloran has influence with the relevant officials. Would it help if the challenge came from more than one party? Mara asked. Harker looked at her over his papers. He was a man of 70-odd years who had seen enough to be skeptical of optimism, but who had also seen enough to recognize when someone was working from a real plan rather than wishful thinking. It might, he said. A challenge with multiple signatories looks different than one individual complaint. I can find more signatories, Mara said. Jose Ruiz had been sitting very still through this conversation, in the way of a man who has learned that hope is expensive and is trying to manage the cost. He looked at Mara and said quietly, "Why are you doing this?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about things she was asked directly. "Because what was done to you was wrong," she said, "and because I have the time and the information, and I might as well use them, and because—" She paused. "Because this town has told me I don't belong here long enough that I've developed an interest in demonstrating otherwise." Jose was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's an honest answer." "I try." Carmen Ruiz, who had said very little during the meeting, reached across the table and briefly covered Mara's hand with hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The challenge was filed in March with 7 signatories, sourced from 3 different families who had their own histories of irregular county dealings. Mara had found them through the network she had been building since October without knowing quite what she was building it for. The water ledger, the fence-mending visits, the conversations on cold doorsteps. She had not recruited them. She had simply been available and been useful and been honest about what she knew, and people who have been waiting for someone to be those things tend to respond. The Halloran response was swift and indicated a level of displeasure that suggested someone had been watching more closely than Mara had anticipated. Within 2 weeks of the filing, Colton received a visit from a man named Sutton, the same Sutton who had handled the original counterclaim. Sutton was a compact, precise man who moved through spaces with the careful efficiency of someone whose job had taught him to read rooms. He arrived at the ranch house on a Tuesday morning, and Mara, who was in the kitchen when he arrived, heard the conversation in the front room without trying particularly hard to. Sutton's message was conveyed with elaborate courtesy and no ambiguity. The Halloran family had noted the challenge with interest and hoped that Reeves Ranch understood the value of maintaining productive relationships in the territory, and that any legal complications arising from poorly considered challenges could have ripple effects on those relationships. It was a threat. It was a well-dressed one, but it was a threat. Colton's response, as Mara heard it, was brief. He said, "Tell the Hallorans I appreciate the message, and tell them that my wife handles the legal paperwork on matters like this, and if they have concerns, they're welcome to bring them to her directly." Silence for a moment on the other side of the door. Then Sutton said, "Your wife." "That's right." Another pause. "I see," Sutton said in the tone of a man recalibrating. After Sutton left, Colton came to the kitchen doorway. He looked at Mara. "You heard that?" he said. "It was not a question. I wasn't trying to." "I know." He leaned against the doorframe. "Was that all right, saying it that way?" She turned it over. He had handed her something, a specific kind of standing, a specific kind of signal sent to the Hallorans about where responsibility lay and how Reeves Ranch was organized. It was not what a man did when he was embarrassed by his wife. "Yes," she said. "That was all right?" He nodded and pushed off the doorframe. He was halfway back to the front room when he stopped. Without turning around, he said, "They're going to push back harder." "I know." "You sure you want to keep going with it?" She looked at the kitchen table, the organized papers, the familiar columns of the work that had become her territory in this house and in this community. She thought about Carmen Ruiz's hand on hers. She thought about the Garcia boy and the water barrels. She thought about what Bess had said. Outlast them. "I'm sure," she said. He went back to his work. She went back to hers. Outside, the March wind was moving through the dry grass with the particular restlessness that came before the season turned. Not warm yet, not fully, but with a different quality than the winter cold. The frontier went through its rhythms without consulting anyone's plans, and what came next came whether you were ready or not. She had been getting ready for a long time. The Halloran pushback came faster and harder than Mara had expected, which told her the water rights challenge had landed somewhere sensitive. Within a week of Sutton's visit, 2 of the 7 signatories on the challenge withdrew their names. They came to Mara separately, on separate days, with separate explanations that were different in detail and identical in substance. There had been conversations, quiet ones, about credit terms and supply arrangements, and the general health of business relationships in the territory. Neither man looked at her directly when he told her. Both of them apologized in the particular way of people who feel genuinely bad about something they are going to do anyway. She thanked them both and updated the filing. 5 signatories was still enough. Harker had confirmed that. But the message was clear. The Hallorans were willing to use their economic reach to thin the challenge out, and if they could get it down to 1 or 2 names, the county office would have political cover to dismiss it without much examination. Mara spent 2 evenings going back through her ledger, looking at the network she had built over the winter, trying to assess who was solid and who was exposed. Cal Story found her at it on a Thursday night when he came to the ranch house to return a borrowed tool, and she forgot to clear the table before she let him in. He looked at the papers without being invited to, the way young men do when they are curious and haven't yet learned to pretend otherwise. "That's the Ruiz thing," he said. "Yes." "How bad is it?" She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, same as Colton had done in January, and looked at the remaining names on the list. "Minter won't pull," he said. "He's too stubborn, and Halloran's man made the mistake of approaching him directly, which put his back up." Mara looked up. "How do you know that?" "Minter told my brother. They've been neighbors for 4 years." Cal looked at the list. "Garcia won't pull either, I don't think. He owes you." "He doesn't owe me anything." Cal gave her a look that was patient and slightly amused in equal measure. "Mrs. Reeves, his boy had water in December because of you. He knows that." He tapped the paper. "That's how it works out here. Not like the town where everything's, I don't know, transactional and hidden. Out here it's simpler. You help someone, they remember." She sat with that for a moment. She had spent enough time in Harlan Ridge's social machinery to have mostly forgotten that other currencies existed. What about the Lowell signature? Bess is solid, he said, with the certainty of someone who had formed a clear opinion. She's got the most to lose if Halloran's crew keeps picking off the smaller claims. She knows it. That left 5 names intact, which was enough. Barely enough, but enough. Mara made a note in the margin and felt the particular steadiness that comes not from confidence, but from having assessed a situation completely and found it survivable. "Why are you helping with this?" she asked. Cal shrugged, the way young men shrug when they mean something they don't want to state directly. "Pete and I needed work in October, and you hired us without making us explain ourselves first." He pushed back from the table. "That's worth something." He left the tool by the door and went back out into the cold March night. Mara sat at the table for a while after he left, in the specific quiet of a house where someone else is asleep in the next room, and thought about the shape of what she was doing and what it was going to require to keep doing it. Spring came in pieces. Warm days alternated with hard freezes well into April, and the grass came back grudgingly in the lower pastures while the high ground stayed brown and stubborn. The creek began running again in a thin, cautious way, and the families that had been hauling water from the Reeves wells came less frequently and then stopped, and the ledger that had defined so much of Mara's winter became a historical document rather than an active one. She kept it. She would keep it. You never knew when a record of who had been where and needed what would become relevant again. The county response to the water rights challenge came in late April. A letter to Harker that said the filing was under review and gave no timeline. Harker read it twice and sent Mara a note saying it was not a dismissal, which was all they could reasonably hope for at this stage. The Hallorans, through Sutton, had apparently filed a response to the challenge, and the county office was now in the position of having to evaluate competing documentation rather than simply rubber stamping the existing arrangement, which was at minimum a change from the previous situation. Mara read Harker's note and filed it with the other paperwork and went back to the ranch's spring planting schedule, which had its own urgent logic that didn't pause for county bureaucracy. It was in May that the rumors reached a new register. She heard it first from Nora Deacon, which was unexpected. Nora stopped her on the main street of Harlan Ridge on a Wednesday morning, stopped her deliberately, stepped into her path with the purposeful directness of a woman who had decided to do something and was doing it before she could change her mind. "I'm going to tell you something," Nora said without preamble, "and I want you to understand I'm not doing it because I particularly like you or because I want anything from you." "All right," Mara said. "The Hallorans have been talking to Colton's primary feed supplier." Nora held her gaze steadily. Her eyes were blue, clear, and at this moment entirely serious. "Not the secondary, the primary. Doyle's operation in Cale. They've suggested to Doyle that his contract with Reeves Ranch is making certain business partnerships more complicated than they need to be." Mara kept her face still. "When?" "Last week. I heard it from my father, who heard it from Doyle's business partner at a dinner in Cale." Nora's chin lifted slightly. "My father thinks it's none of his business. I disagree." "Why are you telling me and not Colton?" Something shifted in Nora's expression. Not quite discomfort, but something adjacent. "Because this started as a problem about you," she said, "and I think it should be solved by you if it can be." She paused. "And because I told Colton 2 years ago that I thought he should consider me seriously, and he told me, very politely, that he didn't see it that way. And I decided then that I was either going to be bitter about it for the rest of my life, or I was going to find a way to respect his judgment." Another pause. Shorter. "I'm working on the second one." It was one of the most honest things anyone in Harlan Ridge had said to Mara in 7 months. She stood on the main street in the May morning and looked at Nora Deacon and felt something shift between them. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the foundation of something that could become useful if they both chose to let it. "Thank you," Mara said. Nora nodded once, briskly, as though thanking her was embarrassing and she wanted to move past it. "Don't make it into something it isn't," she said, and walked away. Mara told Colton that evening. She told him all of it, including the part about Nora, because he deserved the full information. He listened with the same careful stillness he brought to problems he considered serious, and when she finished, he sat for a while without speaking. "Doyle's contract renews in August," he said. I know, I checked. He looked at her. If Doyle pulls the contract, we can source from the Kimball operation near the state line, but it'll cost us more per delivery, and there'll be a quality gap on the winter grain. I know that too. She had run the numbers that afternoon, in the 2 hours between hearing Nora's information and Colton coming in for supper. She pushed the notes across the table to him. It's manageable. It's not good, but it's manageable. He looked at the numbers. That's not the point, he said. No, she agreed. The point is they're escalating. Because the challenge is working. He said it not as a question. If it wasn't working, they'd leave it alone. She had thought the same thing. A threat was a kind of confirmation. It meant the thing being threatened had value. The Hallorans were willing to reach into Colton's supply chain over a water rights challenge filed on behalf of a goat farming family because that challenge, if it succeeded, set a precedent that had implications for a lot of other arrangements in the territory. She had understood that intellectually since March. Now she was watching it play out. What do you want to do? He asked. It was the same question he had asked her in October and in January, and the answer was still the same. She wanted to work the problem. She wanted to find the thing that could be done and do it. I want to talk to Doyle directly, she said. Colton looked at her steadily. That's a 2-day ride to Kale. I know. I can go with you. I'd rather go alone. She said it before she'd fully decided it, and then she sat with it and found it was true. If you come, it's a business call from Reeves Ranch. If I go, it's something else. It's harder to dismiss. He thought about it. She could see him working through the logic of it, checking it from different angles. You think he'll see you? I think if I show up at his operation and ask for 20 minutes of his time, he's likely to give it to me out of curiosity, if nothing else. She folded her hands on the table. People are curious about me right now. I might as well use that. The corner of Colton's mouth moved. Not a full smile, but the shape of one. That's a cold-blooded way to think about it. I learned it from accounting, she said. You use what you have. She rode to Kale in the second week of May, alone, on the mare she had been using since October and had come to trust in the way you trust a horse that doesn't surprise you. It was 2 days each way on the road that ran northeast through open country, crossing 3 creek beds and a stretch of high plain that was beautiful in a spare, undecorated way she had come to appreciate over the winter's worth of riding. She had time to think, and she used it. What she was building in Harlan Ridge had no name and no formal structure. It was a network of mutual obligation and shared interest, held together by nothing more binding than the memory of favors done and information shared and hard winters survived together. It was not a political organization. It was not a legal entity. It was the kind of thing that frontier communities had always run on, quietly, beneath the visible social hierarchy. The layer of actual interdependence that kept people alive when the visible hierarchy was too busy protecting its own interests to notice who was drowning. She had stepped into that layer almost by accident, and she was still learning its dimensions. What she knew was that it was more durable than the town's official social machinery because it was built on need rather than approval, and need was a more reliable adhesive than approval ever was. Doyle's operation outside Kale was bigger than she'd expected. A proper commercial grain and feed enterprise with 3 storage barns and a small office building at the front of the property. A man she took to be Doyle himself was moving between the barns when she rode in. A heavy-set man of about 55 with the look of someone who had built something from nothing and was still slightly surprised it had worked. He looked at her with the open curiosity of someone who had not been forewarned, which told her Nora's information had been accurate. He hadn't been told she was coming. Mr. Doyle, she said from the saddle. My name is Mara Reeves. I've ridden from Harlan Ridge and I'd appreciate 20 minutes of your time. He squinted up at her. Reeves, you're Colton's wife? Yes. He know you're here? Yes. A pause while he assessed this. Then he said, Come on in then, with the flat pragmatism of a man who had decided that the most efficient response to an unexpected situation was to deal with it. She did not perform. She sat across from him in his small, cluttered office and laid out the situation with the same directness she brought to everything, the water rights challenge, the Hallorans' response, what Nora had told her, what it meant for the August contract. She did not editorialize about the Hallorans. She did not ask for sympathy. She put the information on the table and let him look at it. When she finished, Doyle leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You've put me in an uncomfortable position," he said, which was honest, and she appreciated it. "Yes," she said, "the Hallorans have done that. I'm here because you deserve to hear the context from my side before you decide what to do about it." "And what do you want me to do about it?" "Nothing you're not comfortable with," she said. "I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here because you're making a decision that will have effects on a lot of people, and you should make it with complete information rather than with one side of the story." He looked at her for a long time. It was the kind of looking that assessed, that went through surfaces and tried to find what was underneath them. She held still under it. "What's the water claim actually about?" he asked finally. "The real version." She told him about the Ruiz family, all of it. The original claim, the counterfiling, the notation irregularities Harker had found, the two families who had pulled their signatures after economic pressure. She told it plainly, without inflection that asked him to feel anything in particular about it. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've done business with Halloran's people before." "I know." "They're reliable payers, good volume." "I know that too." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You know, when a man sends a representative to suggest I might want to reconsider a business relationship, usually what he's doing is making a reasonable point. Supply chains are relationships. Relationships have politics." He looked at her. "But when a man sends a representative to tell me what to do, that's different." Mara waited. Sutton came to a dinner at the Kimball Ranch last month and spent 20 minutes explaining to 3 different businessmen why their relationships with Reeves Ranch were potentially problematic. He said it without particular emotion. "I don't like being managed. Never have." "No," she said. "I don't imagine you do." He made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a laugh. "Your husband's a good customer, pays on time, doesn't haggle after the contract's signed, doesn't complain about things that aren't worth complaining about." He leaned forward. "I'm not going to pull his contract because the Hallorans have decided they don't like his wife's business." She felt the relief move through her and kept it off her face. "I appreciate that." "Don't appreciate it too much. I'm doing it because it's good business and because I don't like being managed. Not as a favor." He pointed at her with one blunt finger. "You understand the distinction." "I do," she said. "That's why I came to you." The ride back took 2 days in weather that turned on the second day. A cold spring rain that came in from the northwest and soaked through her coat before she was an hour out of the high plain. She rode through it with the steady patience of someone who had been cold and wet and uncomfortable before and knew that the ranch was at the end of the road regardless of the weather between here and there. She got home after dark on the second day. Colton was in the barn when she rode in, doing the last check of the evening. He took her horse without being asked and looked at her wet coat and her tired face and said nothing for a moment. Then, "How'd it go?" "Contract safe," she said. He nodded, once. "You're soaked through." "I'm aware." "Go inside, I'll finish up here." She went inside. She changed and ate the food that had been left warm on the back of the stove and sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee and felt the particular exhaustion of 2 days of riding and one difficult conversation and the accumulated weight of 7 months of doing the same thing over and over. Not winning, not losing, just holding, just being there. The next morning, she woke to the smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, not the clean domestic smell of a morning fire. Something else, something heavier and hotter and wrong in a way that registered before she was fully awake, that pulled her out of sleep with the particular alarm that certain smells carry because they mean something is burning that should not be burning. She was at the window before she knew she had moved. To the south, where the dry grass ran flat for 2 miles before it hit the first of the Ruiz family's fence lines, the sky was the color of a wound, orange and black and moving, not static the way a structure fire moved, but alive, directional, running before the wind with the terrible efficiency of a wildfire that has found its conditions. She could see, even at this distance, how fast it was going. She was pulling on her boots when Colton came through the bedroom door. His face was already set in the particular way of a man who has assessed a situation and is now operating. It started south of the Ruiz claim, he said. Winds out of the southwest. Southwest wind. She ran the geography in her head. The ranch, the creek bed to the north, the Minter place, and the Garcia claim both in the fire's path if it ran northeast the way the wind would push it. Bess Lowell's sod house sat almost directly in the corridor. The town itself was further, but not far enough to feel safe. "How fast is it moving?" she asked. Fast. He was already at the door. "I'm getting Abe and the hands up. We need to get the livestock out of the south pastures first." She was dressed and following him before he finished the sentence, and the calculations were already running in her head. Not panic, not yet. Something colder and more useful than panic. The particular mental state she had found herself in before, facing problems that were large and real and had no solution that was also safe or easy or clean. The smoke was visible to the east now too. The fire was already wider than she had first thought. She did not wait to be told what to do. The south pastures were already orange at the edges when Mara reached the barnyard. Abe Cutler had the hands moving. 6 men pushing the cattle north through the gate in the pre-dawn dark, the animals restless and lowing with the particular distress of livestock that can smell what is coming before they can see it. The horses in the near paddock were moving in tight circles, heads high. The sky to the south had gone from wound-colored to something worse, a deep pulsing red-orange that lit the undersides of the smoke clouds and made the whole horizon look like something that had been torn open. Mara went to Abe first. "How far to the Ruiz fence line?" "Maybe a mile and a half south, maybe less." He was watching the fire's edge the way experienced men watch things that could kill them, steadily, without flinching, calculating. "Wind hasn't shifted. If it holds southwest, it'll run the creek corridor northeast. Straight through the Minter place, the Garcia claim, Bess Lowell." "Yes." He looked at her. "And depending on how wide it gets, the east side of Harlan Ridge." She thought about the irrigation trenches. She had ridden that corridor in every season for 7 months. The old ditches that the previous settlement attempt had cut into the land 20 years ago and then abandoned when the water table proved insufficient for the original plan. They ran northeast to southwest in a rough parallel to the creek bed, wide enough and deep enough to stop moving cattle, dry enough in May to not be mud traps. She had noted them every time she passed because that was how her mind worked. She noted things, filed them, didn't know yet what they were for. Now she knew. "The old irrigation trenches," she said. "South of the Garcia claim." Abe frowned. Not dismissively, he was thinking. "Those haven't been maintained in 2 decades. "I know, but they're still there. If we can widen the gap at the southwest end, break the continuity so the fire hits open dirt instead of grass, we buy time to get people out of the corridor." He was quiet for a moment. The fire's sound was audible now, a low, persistent roar that wasn't loud yet, but had a quality that suggested it intended to get louder. "You'd need people at both ends, someone clearing the trench gaps, someone moving families out ahead of the fire." "Yes. We only have 8 hands, including me." "I know." She was already looking at what she had. "Get 4 men on the livestock. Send Cal and Pete to start on the southwest trench gap. They know that ground. They've ridden it with me. You take the north end toward the Minter claim. I'll take the road." Abe looked at her with the particular expression she had seen on his face a few times over the winter. The expression of a man revising an opinion he had held for a long time and finding it uncomfortable. "That puts you on the road alone." "Someone has to move the families. I know where all of them are." She held his gaze. "I have the ledger in my head, Abe. Every family in that corridor, I know their names and their situations and whether they have a wagon. You don't have that." He held for another 3 seconds. Then, "All right." He turned and started calling names. Colton caught her arm as she was moving toward the mare. His hand was firm but not rough, the grip of someone asking her to stop, not forcing her to. She stopped. "The road goes through the worst of it if the wind shifts," he said. "I know." "Mara." She looked at him. His face in the firelit dark was tight, in a way she hadn't seen before. Not panic, but the particular controlled tension of a man who is afraid and is not going to let the fear make his decisions for him. She recognized it because it was the same thing she was doing. "I'm faster on that road than anyone else you have," she said. and I know exactly whose door to knock on." He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the same careful, deliberate process he brought to everything, except now it was being done in seconds instead of minutes, with fire on the horizon. "Stay ahead of the smoke line, Tet," he said. "If the wind shifts, you leave the road. Don't try to outrun it in the corridor." "I won't. I mean it." "I know you mean it." She put her hand briefly over his. 1 second, no more. And then she was up on the mare and moving. The road south ran straight for the first half-mile, and then bent east before straightening again toward the creek crossing. She pushed the mare hard on the straight stretch and felt the heat before she smelled it. A wall of warm air moving against the morning cool. Wrong. In the way that all the signs of large fire were wrong, nature operating outside its normal register. The Garcia place was first on the road. She heard the children before she reached the gate. The oldest boy, the one she had brought water barrels home for in December, was already in the yard with his father, both of them standing at the fence looking south at the sky. She pulled up hard at their gate. "Get your wagon hitched now," she said. "Take what you can carry in 10 minutes and head north on the road. Don't stop until you're past the Reeves North fence line." Jose Garcia looked at the sky and back at her. "My wife. Where is she?" "Inside. She has the baby." "Tell her 10 minutes. I'll be back through this road in an hour. If you're not gone by then, I'll load you myself." She was already moving, already calculating the next gate. 10 minutes, Jose. Go." The Minter place was 3/4 of a mile further east. She found the old man in his barn, and found, to her surprise, that he had already gotten his animals out and was hitching his wagon with the methodical efficiency of a man who had survived hard things before and knew exactly what to do when the next one arrived. He looked up at her without apparent surprise. "I figured someone would come," he said. "Didn't figure it'd be you. Can you make the North Road?" "If you leave me alone long enough to finish hitching, I can." He didn't say it rudely. He said it the way he said everything, flat and factual and without decoration. "The Garcias are south of me. You go to them?" "They're hitching. The fire's running northeast. You've got time if you move now." She turned the mare. "Minter. There's a family 2 claims east, name of Hollis. I think they have an older man who can't walk without help." He looked up from the hitch. "I know the Hollises. Go east before you go north. Make sure they have a way out." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man deciding whether to take direction from someone he hadn't previously taken direction from. Then he said, "All right," and went back to the hitch. She moved east. The smoke was thicker now, dropping lower, and the mare was unhappy with it, flaring her nostrils, shaking her head, wanting to turn north on her own instinct. Mara held her steady through it, talking low and continuous, the way her mother had talked her through her own fears when she was small, and the world felt too large for the space she occupied in it. The Hollis place was small and sat in a low spot that was going to be a problem if the fire crested the east rise before they got out. She found a man of about 70. Franklin Hollis, she remembered his name from the water ledger. He had come twice in December with his grandson to haul water, struggling to get a cart horse backed into a harness while smoke rolled over the low ridge to the south. The horse was not cooperating. Horses rarely cooperated with fire nearby. She jumped down from the mare and went to the horse's head without being asked, talking, steady, both hands on the halter, the same low voice she'd been using on her own mare. The horse was trembling all over, but it stopped moving backward. Franklin got the hitch fastened with hands that shook from either age or fear or both. "Where's your grandson?" she asked. "In the house. He's 12. Get him and your essential documents, nothing else." The boy came out at a run, already carrying a small box that she hoped contained what they needed. She helped Franklin up onto the cart seat. His hip was bad, she could see it in how he moved, and made sure the boy was settled beside him. "North Road. Stay on it. Minter should be coming behind you. He knows you're on the road." Franklin looked down at her from the cart with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Then he said, "I heard what they said about you, in town." She looked up at him. The smoke was burning her eyes and she had no time for this conversation, but she stayed for it anyway because something in his voice said he needed to say it. "I'm sorry we laughed," he said. Simply, without elaboration. She held that for a moment. "Drive north, Franklin. Get your grandson safe." He drove north. She got back on the mare and pushed east to check the 2 remaining claims she had in her mental ledger for this corridor. The first was empty. They'd already gone, or they'd been gone before the fire. She didn't know and didn't have time to determine. The second was a family named Strickland, newcomers who had filed a claim in March, and whose names she had just added to her records the week before. She found the wife and 3 small children alone. Her husband apparently out on the claim checking something when the fire started. The woman standing in the yard with a look of pure frozen terror that Mara recognized as the moment before action and the moment before paralysis sitting side by side. "Do you have a horse?" Mara asked. "One. No wagon." "Can you ride?" "Not well." Mara dismounted. "You're riding now. You'll be fine." She was already checking the horse in the small corral, a bay gelding, calm enough, probably older. "I'll put the children up first, oldest in front of you, the 2 small ones." She looked at the 3 children, assessed, decided. "The 2 small ones I'll take on my mare, she can carry them." The woman, Louise, she said her name was Louise, got herself up onto the bay with a determination that overrode her inexperience. Mara put the oldest child, a girl of about 8, in front of her and showed Louise how to hold the reins. Then she mounted her own mare with the 2 youngest children braced against her, one in each arm, the mare snorting her objection to the increased smoke and the unfamiliar weight. "Stay on the road north," she said. "It doesn't matter how fast you go. Just stay on it." They moved north together, Mara holding the 2 children with a grip that she thought probably left marks but couldn't help. The mare moving at a careful trot because Mara couldn't manage faster without risking the children. She could hear the fire behind them now. Not just the roar, but the crackle, the individual sound of things burning, which meant it was closer than the roar alone had suggested. The wind shifted. She felt it on the back of her neck, the air direction changing, not dramatically, not a full reversal, but enough to push the smoke column east instead of northeast. It changed the math. It meant the fire's main corridor was now running more directly east, toward the Halloran Range rather than straight into the Harlan Ridge residential corridor. It bought time. It also meant the road she was on was no longer in the direct path. She breathed. She got Louise Strickland and her children to the Reeves North fence line and handed the 2 smallest ones down to a ranch hand who had been sent back to manage incoming evacuees. She made sure Louise understood she was safe and that someone would look for her husband. She did not stay. She went back south. She did not plan to go back south. But she was a quarter-mile down the return road when she heard a sound that didn't fit. A horse, distressed, and under it a human voice, male, calling out with the particular quality of a call that was losing strength. She followed the sound east off the road into the scrub. She found a man she didn't immediately recognize on the ground, his horse standing over him with panicked eyes. The man had come off his horse. She could see the story of it in the trampled grass, the horse shying from the smoke, and the man going down hard. He was conscious, barely, holding his left arm against his chest. His face, when she got close enough, was Rupert Pratt. She stopped for just a moment. Rupert Pratt, whose wife had told her to get off the wedding stage. Rupert Pratt, who had stood beside his wife and said nothing while the crowd laughed. Rupert Pratt, whose family had been part of the Whisper campaign that had made 7 months of her life consistently harder. She got off her horse. "Can you stand?" she said. He looked up at her. He was in pain and he was scared, and there was a moment when he registered who she was. She saw it cross his face, the recognition, and under it something she didn't have time to interpret. "I don't know," he said. "My arm, it might be broken. We'll deal with that later." She crouched beside him. "I need you to try to stand. I can't carry you." He tried. He got to one knee with her shoulder under his good arm and made a sound that she recognized as a man refusing to make a louder sound, the specific controlled pain sound of someone maintaining dignity, because it's the only thing they can still manage. He got to his feet. She got him up onto her mare's back with a combined effort that was not graceful, and that left her winded and him white in the face. She held his good arm over her shoulder and led the mare north on foot, moving at a pace that was fast enough and slow enough at the same time. Fast enough because the smoke was still wrong, slow enough because Rupert Pratt was on the edge of falling off her horse and she needed to watch his balance. They didn't speak. There wasn't air for it, with the smoke dropping and the effort of moving. She focused on the road ahead and put one foot in front of the other. It took 20 minutes to reach the north fence line. It felt longer. When she handed Rupert off to the ranch hand who came running, the man looked at her face and then at Pratt's, and then back at her with an expression she didn't have the energy to respond to. She tied her mare to the fence post and sat down on the ground beside it, because her legs had decided they were done and she thought it was better to sit down deliberately than to fall down accidentally. She was still sitting there when Colton found her. He came from the south, where he had been working with Abe on the trench lines. His face was black with smoke, and his jacket had a burn at the shoulder where an ember had caught. He looked at her sitting in the dirt beside the fence post and crouched down without a word. "Pratt's arm is broken," she said. "He's over there." Colton looked where she indicated, at the cluster of people near the barn, at the shape of Rupert Pratt being helped toward the house. He was quiet for a moment. "You found him out there?" "He was off his horse east of the road." Colton looked back at her. She couldn't read his expression fully through the smoke residue and the exhaustion on his face, but there was something in it that she had not often seen there, something that was past the careful, deliberate man she knew, past the controlled problem solver, something raw. "You all right?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she always tried to think about things she was asked directly. Her eyes were burning from smoke. Her arms were tired from holding children. Her boots were destroyed. She had put her shoulder under Rupert Pratt's armpit and walked him out of a fire that his wife had told her she didn't belong in. "Yes," she said. "I think so." He sat down beside her on the ground. Not something she had expected. Colton did not generally sit in the dirt beside fence posts, but he sat down next to her and they both looked south, where the smoke was still rising, but the fire's roar had diminished to something that sounded more like distance than immediate threat. The trench lines had held. She could see from the burn pattern on the south horizon that the fire had run against the cleared ground and been deflected east, where it had found the Halloran Range's managed fire break and eventually spent itself on bare dirt and rock. Cal Story appeared from the south road, smoke black and walking with the careful gait of someone whose feet hurt. He saw them sitting by the fence post and didn't comment on it. He stopped a few feet away and looked south. "Trench held," he said. "Pete's still out there making sure the east end is clear." "Casualties?" Colton asked. "Wickies has burns on both hands. Nothing worse than that, from what I can tell." Cal looked at Mara. "Strickland's wife said you had her kids on your horse. They needed a ride." He looked at her for another moment, not with the usual careful assessment, but with something simpler, something that hadn't been filtered through social calculation. Then he said, "There are people up by the barn that want to talk to you." She looked toward the barn. There were more people than she had expected. The Garcia family, the Minter wagon, Louise Strickland with her children clustered around her, old Franklin Hollis sitting on a feed barrel with his grandson beside him. Bess Lowell was there with her 3 children, having apparently come down the north road from the other direction. A number of faces she knew from the ledger, from cold doorsteps, from fence mending and water hauling, and the small, unspectacular transactions of 7 months of being present. She looked at them from where she sat in the dirt. She was not ready to stand up yet. She was tired in a way that went past physical, the kind of tired that needed a few more minutes of sitting by a fence post before it could be addressed. Colton, sitting beside her, said nothing. He let her have the minutes. That, she thought, was its own kind of thing. She stood up when she was ready. Not when someone came to get her, not when the situation demanded it, not when the gathered people at the barn had waited long enough that it would have been rude to stay seated any longer. She stood up when her legs had decided they were willing again, and when the particular exhaustion in her chest had settled from something acute into something she could carry. Colton stood when she did, without comment, and they walked toward the barn together with the smoke still rising to the south and the morning light coming up gray and flat through the haze. The people at the barn didn't cheer. It was not that kind of moment. They were too tired for that, too smoke-blackened and wrung out, too close to what had almost happened to have the energy for anything theatrical. What they did was turn toward her when she came, and the turning itself was a thing she felt. Jose Garcia put his hand out. She shook it. His wife Carmen stood just behind him with the baby on her hip, and the older children pressed close, and she looked at Mara with an expression that said everything she didn't have English words for, or maybe words of any kind. Old Minter was there, which surprised her. He had driven the Hollis family out in his wagon and come back, which she had not asked him to do and which cost him time he didn't have with his own animals to settle. He stood at the edge of the group with his hat in his hands and nodded at her when she looked at him. It was not a man who nodded easily. She returned it. Bess Lowell came through the group and hugged her without warning, which was also not a thing Bess did easily. Mara accepted it with one arm because she was still not entirely sure her body was taking full instructions, and she felt Bess's 3 children attached to various points on their mother's body, and the particular warmth of a cluster of people who had been scared and were now not scared and were locating each other to confirm it. "Your plan worked," Bess said, against her shoulder. "The trench worked," Mara corrected. "And the wind shifted. I can't take credit for the wind." Bess pulled back and looked at her. "You can take credit for knowing about the trench." Louise Strickland was there with her husband, who had been found alive and unhurt in the East Scrub, having gotten himself to high ground when the fire started, and watched it pass below him with what he described, when they found him, as the worst 2 hours of his life. He was a young man, maybe 25, and he shook Mara's hand with both of his and didn't say anything for a moment because he was not yet at a point where words were the right tool. Cal and Pete Story came in from the South Road while she was still standing with the barn crowd, both of them thoroughly destroyed by the morning's work. Smoke dark, burned at the wrists and forearms where embers had caught, moving like men whose bodies had given most of what they had. Cal looked at the gathered people and at Mara at the center of it with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone whose opinion of a thing has been confirmed and who finds the confirmation both satisfying and slightly uncomfortable because it requires revising the story you told yourself about how things work. Abe Cutler came last. He had been with the South crew through the whole morning, directing the trench clearing with the same economy of motion and authority he brought to everything. He was not a man who sought her out. He moved through his work and his world in a deliberate line, and the line rarely bent toward social exchange. He came to where she was standing and he looked at her for a moment. "The east section held better than I expected," he said. "That's where you said to start the clearing." "I thought the fire would run wider on the east side," she said. "The ground is flatter." He nodded. It did. He held the nod for a moment. "You were right about that." It was not an apology for 7 months of polite skepticism. It was not a declaration of anything. It was a man who valued accuracy stating an accurate thing to a person who had earned the accuracy. From Abe Cutler, it was worth more than a speech. Rupert Pratt's arm was broken in 2 places. The ranch's nearest thing to a medical professional was a man named Tibbs, who had done field surgery during a border conflict 15 years earlier and had since retired to a horse operation north of town. And Tibbs was sent for and arrived by mid-morning to set the arm with the brisk efficiency of someone for whom broken bones were a known quantity. Rupert was laid out in the ranch house's spare bedroom, pale and medicated with whatever Tibbs had in his bag, when Deirdre Pratt arrived. Mara was in the kitchen when Deirdre came in. There was no avoiding it. The kitchen was between the front door and the spare bedroom, and Deirdre had to pass through it. She came in wearing her good clothes because she had ridden from town the moment the messenger reached her and had not taken the time to change, and there was a quality to her face that Mara had never seen there before. Stripped. The social performance was gone. What was underneath it was a woman who had been frightened for her husband and was now looking at the person who had gotten him out of the fire. They stood in the kitchen and looked at each other. Deirdre Pratt was not a stupid woman. She had always known, Mara thought, exactly what she was doing when she was doing it. The cruelty at the wedding, the subsequent whisper campaign, the years of accumulated small contempt, none of that had been thoughtless. It had been deliberate, which was worse, but which also meant that whatever Deirdre did now would be deliberate too. "He's going to be all right," Mara said, because the woman needed to hear it, and because it was true, and because the space needed something in it before the silence said something irreparable. Deirdre's face moved, not dramatically, just at the edges, the particular movement of controlled emotion being maintained at some effort. "I know," she said. "Tibbs told me." Silence. "I heard you found him," Deirdre said. "He was east of the road." "Yes." Deirdre looked at the kitchen table, at the papers still there from Mara's morning before the fire, the ledger and the account books, and the accumulated paperwork of a household and a network, and a 7-month project of making herself useful. She looked at them and seemed to see them, really see them, not as the clutter of someone who didn't belong, but as evidence of what had been happening in this house and on this land while the town was busy deciding what to think about the woman who lived there. "I said something at your wedding," Deirdre said. She still wasn't looking at Mara. "I said it loudly." "You did." "I meant it at the time." She said it with the honesty of someone who has decided that partial truths are no longer worth the effort. "That probably makes it worse." "Probably," Mara agreed. Deirdre finally looked at her. Her eyes were dry, which Mara respected. It would have been easy to cry, and crying would have felt like pressure, like a performance designed to extract forgiveness. "I don't know what to do with this," Deirdre said. "I don't know how to—" She stopped, started again. "I've been wrong before. I don't usually have to face it this directly." Mara thought about what to say. She was tired and her eyes still stung, and she had 2 children's worth of hand-shaped bruises forming on her arms, and she did not have the emotional reserve for a scene. But she also looked at this woman, this difficult, proud, deliberately unkind woman, and saw underneath all of that a person who had organized her understanding of the world around hierarchies that she had never examined and was being asked quite suddenly to examine all at once. "You don't have to do anything about it right now," Mara said. "Go sit with your husband." Deirdre stood there for another moment. Then she nodded, once, the same decisive nod she probably used for everything. Decisions made and executed without lingering. She walked through the kitchen and down the hall to the spare bedroom. She did not say thank you. That was all right. Some things took longer than a morning. The county response on the Ruiz Water Rights Challenge came 3 weeks after the fire, which was faster than anyone had expected. Harker believed the timing was connected to the fire's behavior. The fact that it had run across Halloran's range, as well as the smaller claims, had shifted the political dynamics in ways that were not entirely predictable. The Hallorans had lost a section of fencing and 2 hay storage structures to the east edge of the fire, which had put them in the position of accepting assistance from the same community network they had been trying to dismantle through economic pressure. It was the kind of irony that the frontier delivered without commentary. The county ruling found in favor of the original Ruiz claim. The irregularities Harker had identified in the counterfiling were determined to be material, and the counterclaim was invalidated. Jose and Carmen Ruiz received official documentation of their water access rights on a Thursday morning in early June, and Mara found out about it through a note that Cal Story brought to the ranch on his way back from town. She read it at the kitchen table and then sat with it for a while, in the specific quiet of an empty kitchen. It was not a triumphant feeling. She had learned, over the months, to be suspicious of triumphant feelings. They tended to arrive too early and distract you from the work that still needed doing. What she felt was something more subdued, a kind of solid satisfaction, the feeling of a thing being as it should be, like a column of numbers that finally balanced. She wrote back to Harker thanking him for his work. She wrote a separate note to the Ruiz family. She updated the ledger. The conversation that changed things, or rather confirmed what had already changed, happened in July in the Harlan Ridge Meeting Hall at a public discussion about drought preparation for the coming fall. It was the first public meeting Mara had attended since the wedding, not because she had been avoiding them, but because she had not been invited to any of the social events that served as precursors, and she had not wanted to walk into a room where she had not been wanted. This meeting was different. It was a practical meeting. Water management, fire preparedness, supply coordination, and practicality had always been her territory. She sat near the back when she arrived. Old habit. The seats near the back gave you the full room. George Partlin was at the front, which made sense. He organized most of the town's civic gatherings. He saw her come in, and there was a moment, brief, where something moved across his face. She held his gaze steadily and found her seat. The meeting had been going for about 20 minutes when the discussion turned to fire response. What had worked in May, what hadn't, what should be done differently before fall. Several people spoke about the livestock evacuation and the road coordination. Then a man named Al Torres, who ran a feed operation on the west side of town and who had been in the road corridor the morning of the fire, said, "We should talk about the trench system. Someone had to know about those ditches and think to use them." The room was quiet for a moment. Bess Lowell said from the middle section, "That was Mara Reeves." It was not a dramatic announcement. Bess said it the way she said everything, directly, without performance, because it was accurate and relevant and the room needed to have the accurate information. But the directness of it landed in the space the way accurate things do when a room has been carefully not naming something. Several people turned to look at Mara. She was aware of being looked at. She had been aware of being looked at in this town for most of her adult life. The difference now was in the quality of the looking. "There are families in this room alive because of decisions she made that morning," Cal's story said. He was standing near the side wall, and he said it without particular emphasis, the way young men state things when they are no longer uncertain about them. "I was there. I watched her work the problem." More silence. Not the cold silence of exclusion, a different kind. The silence of a room taking something in. George Partlin, at the front, cleared his throat. He looked at Mara. His face had the expression of a man who understood clearly and fully the nature of what he was doing and what it cost him. "Mrs. Reeves," he said, "I wonder if you'd be willing to come up and talk about the irrigation system, what you know about it, and how it might be maintained for future use." She stood up from the back of the room. She walked to the front. She was heavy-set and plain-featured, and her hands were rough, and she had not changed anything about herself to earn what the room was giving her. She stood at the front and told them about the trenches, where they ran, what condition they were in, what it would take to maintain them, what they could do if the fire came again. She told it plainly, the way she told everything, without flourish and without false modesty, because both of those things were forms of dishonesty, and she had no patience for either. The room listened. After the meeting, people came to speak to her. Not everyone. Some people left quickly, and some of the ones who had been the loudest in their contempt found reasons to exit before she was free, which she noted and did not pursue. Some things took longer than a summer. She knew that. But Nora Deacon came to her, and this time there was something different in her face. The careful calculation was gone, replaced by something more direct. "My father wants to discuss a land management proposal with you and Colton," she said. "Coordinated fire response across the major claims. He thinks you're the right person to administer it." Mara looked at her. "That would mean the Deacon family and Reeves Ranch in a formal working arrangement." "Yes." "Your father understands what he's proposing." "He's the one who proposed it," Nora said, with a slight dryness that Mara found, for the first time, genuinely likable. "He's a practical man. He's been watching what you've built for 7 months. He's not going to ignore it because it makes social situations complicated." The Pratt situation resolved itself in the way difficult things resolve when the people involved are too proud for grand gestures but too honest to do nothing. Rupert's arm healed over 6 weeks, and during those 6 weeks he spent more time than he was accustomed to sitting still with nothing to do but think. He came to the ranch once, in July, on his own, without Deirdre. Mara was in the yard when he rode in, working on the water schedule for the south pastures, and she straightened up and looked at him as he dismounted. He was thinner from the recovery. He moved carefully, the arm still in a support wrap. He stood by his horse and looked at her, and she could see the effort it cost him. The particular effort of a man who has built his self-image on a set of beliefs that have been systematically dismantled by events he cannot reinterpret. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I know," she said. "Take your time." He looked at the ground for a moment. "My wife was wrong at the wedding. I was wrong for not saying so." He looked up. "I'm saying so now for what it's worth." "It's worth something," she said honestly. "I suppose that'll have to do." "It'll do fine, Rupert." He nodded. He remounted, which he did with the careful dignity of a man managing pain without making a production of it. He rode back down the road without looking back. It was not a resolution that looked good in the telling. No tearful reconciliation, no public declaration, no transformation scene with a swell of feeling underneath it. It was what it was. 2 people in a yard, one of them admitting to something he'd rather not have had to admit, the other accepting it without requiring more than he could give. The frontier did not deal in storybook endings. It dealt in what people actually managed to do when the pressure was on and the social scaffolding had been stripped away, and the only thing left was what you actually were. She had learned that. She had been learning it for 7 months in the most direct possible way, by being the person the town had decided was not enough. And being that person so consistently and so completely that eventually the town had run out of room to hold that belief alongside the evidence. On an evening in late summer, she was sitting on the porch of the ranch house with Colton, watching the light go long and golden across the south pastures. The grass had come back after the fire, not everywhere, not evenly, but in the patches where the trench lines had protected the soil, it was already thick and green, and the cattle were back in the south rotation, and the ranch was running as it should run. Colton had a coffee cup, and she had a ledger open on her knee, which was not romantic, but was accurate to who they both were. She was updating the fall supply estimates, and he was doing nothing, which for Colton meant he was thinking about something he would eventually say. "Deacon's proposal's a good one," he said. "I know." "You're going to say yes." "I was going to ask you first." He looked at her sideways. "You don't need my permission." "No," she said, "but you'll be living with the consequences, and your opinion matters." She looked up from the ledger. "That's different from permission." He was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was sitting with what she'd said. "Yes," he said, "I suppose it is." They sat with the evening for a while, the kind of quiet that settles between two people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side still willing to sit in the same space, not comfortable in the soft sense, not easy, but honest, which was worth more. She thought about the wedding. She had thought about it many times over the months, in the particular involuntary way that hard memories surface when you're tired or your guard is down. She thought about the laughter and the cold weight of it, and the 1 second she had stopped walking before she made herself start again. She thought about Colton stepping off that platform. She thought about what it would have meant to be the woman the town wanted her to be. Shrinking, apologetic, managing the constant effort of making herself smaller so other people could be more comfortable. She had tried that in her earlier years. She had tried being invisible, and she had tried being accommodating, and she had tried adjusting the shape of herself to fit spaces that hadn't been built for her. None of it had worked, and not only because it hadn't earned her the town's respect. It hadn't worked because it had cost her the most important thing, the ability to be useful. You could not think clearly when you were managing the performance of yourself. You could not solve problems when half your mind was occupied with whether you were taking up too much space. She had stopped doing it somewhere in those first weeks at the ranch. She had stopped and simply been what she was. Competent, direct, present, imperfect. And the work had flowed from that in ways she could not have engineered by trying. That was the thing the town had never understood about her, that her worth was not visible from the outside because it had never been located there. It had always been in the quality of her attention, in the patience with which she looked at problems, in the particular kind of courage that is not dramatic or photogenic, not the courage of a single crisis moment, but the courage of continuing to show up after being told, repeatedly, that you are not wanted and not welcome and not enough. That kind of courage was harder than the fire. She had known that since October. The Ruiz family named their new well after her. Not formally, it was not the kind of community that put names on wells formally, but in the way families name things within their own walls, in the private language of a household. Carmen told her about it in August, almost offhandedly, the way you mention something that has become so natural to you that you forget it isn't already known. "The children call it the Mara well," she said, "when they go to draw water." Mara looked at her. She was not going to be sentimental about it. She was not built for sentimentality, had never had the luxury of it, and she was not going to start now. "As long as the water's good," she said. Carmen laughed. A real laugh. The full warm kind. "The water is very good." In September, the Deacon land management proposal was signed by 4 of the territory's major operations, with Mara named as coordinating administrator. It was not a legal title. It was not paid. It was the kind of role that existed because someone needed to do it, and someone had demonstrated they could, and the politics had eventually bent around the demonstration. She took it the same way she took everything, as work that needed doing, with the same methodical attention she brought to the supply accounts and the water ledger and the trench planning and the 7 months of small, useful acts that had preceded it. The fall came in dry again, which in this territory it almost always did, and the preparations they had made carried the community through the lean stretch better than the previous year. Not perfectly. Nothing on the frontier happened perfectly, and the idea that it could was a kind of lie that the land itself refused to support. The Strickland claim had a bad month in October and needed help, and got it because the network was there now to provide it. Old Franklin Hollis's grandson turned out to be genuinely gifted with horses, which Cal's story noticed, and which led to an arrangement that benefited both families in practical ways that had nothing romantic or remarkable about them. Mara kept the ledger. She kept adding names. She was not loved by Harlan Ridge in any simple or total sense. Some people still felt what they had always felt, that something had gone wrong in the natural order when Colton Reeves had married a woman like her, and that no amount of subsequent usefulness entirely corrected that original wrongness. Those people were not going to change. She had stopped expecting them to. But they had stopped saying it out loud. They had stopped saying it partly because the social permission for it had been withdrawn, and partly because the evidence against it was too consistent to argue with, but mostly because the community they lived in had been reorganized, quietly and without announcement, around a different set of values, the values of competence and mutual obligation, and the hard-won knowledge that the frontier did not care about your social hierarchy when the fire was running and you needed someone who knew about old irrigation ditches. She had not changed her appearance. She had not sought revenge. She had not made speeches or demanded recognition or waited for someone to hand her a place at the table. She had simply, stubbornly, persistently been present and useful until the table had rearranged itself around where she was already standing. Standing beside Colton one evening in the last light of October, the same month they had married, a full year later, looking south at the pastures and the trench lines and the land that had tried to burn and hadn't, she thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. She had thought, when she was younger, that belonging was something other people decided about you, that it was a status conferred from outside, a door opened or kept closed by the people who already lived on the other side of it. She had spent years trying to fit herself to that understanding, adjusting and accommodating and making herself useful in the hope that usefulness would earn admission. What she had learned, the hard, slow, expensive way, in the way that things learned through living tend to stick, was that belonging was not a door. It was a foundation. And you built it yourself, under your own feet, out of whatever you had available, by doing the work that needed doing and being who you were while you did it. The foundation she had built in this place was imperfect and uneven and had been built under conditions that were not fair and not kind and not anything she would have chosen. But it was hers. It was solid. And it was large enough now to hold more than just herself. Colton, beside her, finished his coffee and set the cup on the porch rail. He did not say anything about the view or the evening or the year that had passed. He was not a man who marked things with speeches. But after a moment he said, "You want to talk about next spring's pasture rotation?" She opened the ledger on her knee. "I've already started the notes," she said. He looked at her sideways, and that almost smile was there again, the one that she had come to know as one of the few expressions he gave away freely. "Of course you have," he said. The light went long and amber across the south pastures. The cattle moved in the near field with the slow, deliberate rhythm of animals that were fed and watered and not afraid. The trench lines ran straight and clean across the land in the distance, already part of the landscape, already becoming the kind of thing that people would eventually stop noticing because it had always been there. It had not always been there. She knew that. She had made it. That was enough. That had always been enough. She had just taken a while to believe it.